Okay, well, it's that time again. Welcome to week 3 of our 6-part series for the VAC 45 program opportunities and considerations. These are 30-minute sessions. We will try and do our best to stick to that 30 minutes, but we will stick around longer. If anyone has any questions, we will stick around longer to answer those. So last week, Dr. Rosalind Biggs discussed herd health programs designed for VAC 45 certification. For those unable to attend last week, that webinar is now available on the Beef Extension website. You can find that by going to beef.okstate.edu. This week we have Dr. Paul Beck, Extension Livestock Specialist, to discuss nutritional programs and implants for VAC 45 programs. And with that, Dr. Beck, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm Paul Beck. I'm Extension Livestock Specialist here at Oklahoma State. I was asked to talk about nutritional programs and implants and other growth promoting technologies that would work with VAC 45 programs. A couple of weeks ago, Kelly talked about some of the economics and some of the premiums that are associated with these programs. But, whenever we start looking at weaning in early October and holding on to calves, 45 or 60 days, there's an appreciable increase in the market, a seasonal improvement in the price of calves that she had pointed out. And if we can, part of the economics that Dr. Lawman is going to talk about in a few weeks are going to be associated with, economically putting gain on these cattle and adding value to them, not just through the premiums of a VAC 45 program, but by economically adding weight to these cattle. So I'm going to share the screen and get started with this. The first thing I would like to do is ask some poll questions. So I'm just going to keep going and let everybody answer this first poll, and then as we go through, I'll add the next polls up there. So when we're looking at trying to do something new, if we haven't done this before, and a lot of times whenever I do something new, I feel like this happens to me. It turns into we can, if we aren't prepared, we can do a lot of things wrong, we can mess a lot of things up, and we can irritate a lot of people. But when we're weaning calves and trying to
he is getting brave, isn't he? Whoa! One weekend. Whoa!
He said I wouldn't, so I had
one weekend. Whoa! I can't even sign.
So part of feeding cattle post weaning or even pre-weaning, when we're looking at the growth and development of these cattle, we're trying to get cattle into the growth phase where we're adding protein or muscle to these cattle, such that we're not adding so much weight that we start adding fat. As cattle grow and mature, protein growth increases at a decreasing rate. And then fat laydown, as we increase maturity or we increase the rate of gain, we can add more fat. We can shift this growth curve by either feeding cattle excessively fast. We can move that to where they're putting on more fat as they're gaining weight. Or if we look at an extended period of low growth with like a stocker program on dormant native range, we're adding more frame, and then we will increase that subsequent mature weight. Another way to do that is through the use of growth promoting implants. Those increase protein accretion and shift that curve more to the left, so cattle are being, gaining at a lower stage of maturity, thus increasing protein gain for whatever body weight we're looking at and decreasing fat gain. Another growth promoting technology that we need, one of the growth promoting technologies we need to look at as well is looking at ionophores. They're been widely used and accepted since the 1970s. They're really just a targeted antibiotic, but they're not a medically important antibiotic to humans. So we don't need a veterinary script in order to include these in diets. But they serve to increase ruminal microbe protein and energetic efficiency. So we're able to get more from the diets than without these. They're also a coccidiostat. That's originally what the compound was used for in poultry. And this is also very important in receiving and weaning calves, because we're going under stress, and these cattle will be more susceptible to the bloody scours and coccidiosis from that infection. Ionophores increase gains of growing and finishing calves by 1/10 to 2/10 of a pound per day, and also mostly on finishing cattle can increase the efficiency of that gain. Anabolic steroids, implants, they've been widely used since the 1950s. They're safe and effective in growth promoting technology. About 90% or more of all feedlot cattle or finishing cattle receive one or more implant in a lifetime. That's much lower on stocker operations and very low on cow-calf operations. About 78% of large stocker operations implant, where only about 56% of smaller operations implant. How they work: they, like I said before, they enhance lean tissue and fat deposition. They increase feed efficiency and increase carcass weight on these cattle. So, improve the overall beef production and beef production efficiency through the use of these. I've been asked a lot over time about, and we see a lot of this in social media and competing feed meats, what's the estrogen content whenever we implant a calf? An unimplanted beef steer has a fairly low estrogen content. This is in nanograms per pound. And it does increase a little whenever we implant a beef calf. But compared to an open cow, where most of our hamburger meat comes from, it's about 6 times higher. So that, that's a natural form of estrogen, or that hormone. So, we see an increase in estrogen, and this is in nanograms per pound, like I said, so it's a very small unit of measure. But whenever we start comparing this to other foods, potatoes, legumes, those are quite a bit higher in estrogen. Something like cabbage, it's pretty, we think this is pretty innocuous, 10,000 nanograms per pound for cabbage. And all of those, are really about zero compared to something like soy milk. Legumes, a lot of these have very high estrogen content, and even the soy milk is really actually fairly low compared to what would occur in the human body. So when we look at implanting of beef animals, it's of such a very low content that, it's really not of concern. And, that's not saying that we shouldn't provide, unimplanted beef to consumers that are interested in it, if they're willing to pay for that. So what do implants do? Here's an example of some cattle we had on wheat pasture, and we had them stocked where they either gained a fairly low amount of weight versus a fairly high rate of gain. And in both cases, we implanted these steers and heifers. We got about a 0.3 pound per day increase in body weight gain, and that's about a 15 to 20% increase in performance. On these one calves, we went from about 1.4 pounds a day up to about 1.7 pounds a day. Another set of cattle we had, gained nearly 2.25 pounds a day whenever they were unimplanted, and right at 2.5 pounds a day. So we see that increase in performance on these growing cattle, at a very wide range of basal performance or baseline performance without the implant. So we'll get into this subject where we're, talking about today. I looked at some research that had been conducted over time, looking at implants during the preconditioning or receiving phase, and this would be either post-weaning of retained calves or receiving high-risk stocker calves into their facilities. So Dr. Terry Mader, when he was at University of Nebraska, about 30 years ago, he looked at raw grow during preconditioning and then followed those cattle on with multiple implants later during finishing. In these two trials, in both the 80s and the 90s, he saw right at a 0.2 pound or nearly a quarter pound increase in performance during that 60-day preconditioning period that they looked at. In the first trial, they actually saw no influence on subsequent performance. So when they re-implanted those cattle, they did not see a lower performance for those cattle that are re-implanted. And that corresponds with a lot of the rumors we hear about cattle that are implanted before we sell them. A lot of the buyers will say that they wouldn't like to have them implanted previously because they don't respond. Well, here's another study where we had increased gains during finishing because when they were implanted earlier. Jace Ball, he did some research more recently where he looked at Revlor G during preconditioning. This is a longer term implant. It will last about 120 to 140 days. Saw about a 0.3 pound increase in gain during preconditioning and stocker phase. So they followed those cattle all the way till they hit feedlot, and they saw this really good improvement in gain. There's a study I did with Kim Poe and on her masters, and we looked at these high-risk calves coming into the feedlot, and these cattle, came out of the southeast. They were long-haul cattle under a considerable amount of stress, and we looked at giving them a raw grow implant when we got those into the receiving facility. We didn't see much of a change in performance, but with these cattle, we had over 80% sick bulls. And so, these cattle were under such health challenge that we really didn't see an improvement in gain. We wouldn't expect to see this with cattle being weaned on the ranch during our own preconditioning period. Then there's another study, this Richardson study that we looked at. We used a Synovex S implant, and during that 45-day receiving period, when we gave an implant at arrival, these cattle gained an extra 0.2 pounds. And then during the grazing, when we followed that up on the right side of the screen, we retained that advantage in gain throughout the grazing period compared to unimplanted calves. When we delayed implanting, just because those implants had a, have right at 140 days, and these cattle, the total period was 160 days, we did see a little bit lower gain during grazing, but that was just during the last period of that. And overall ownership of these stocker calves, we didn't see any difference in performance for the total ownership period. So we don't really see a carryover effect going from preconditioning or receiving into the subsequent phase of production, whether it's during grazing or into the feedlot. So we're going to share the results and let people see. It looks like most of the people that are intending will, keep cattle at least 45 days. Only 25% will move them, previous to that 45 days. Relaunch polling. So I'm going to put up the second poll, and basically it's what's our general feeding system that we're going to try to use with these calves whenever we keep them. So as far as feeding programs, there's multiple ways to get to the same result. We can look at dry lot versus pasture, supplemental feeding, supplement just basically by feeding them most of what they're going to get. Look at hay with supplement or dry grass with supplement versus just total mixed rations. And we can get acceptable performance in doing it both ways, or all those ways. I wanted to show an example of, what are the impacts of targeting gain, looking at 500-pound calf, fed a good quality Bermuda grass hay. I priced it in at $90 per ton, a 14% protein supplement that's approximately a third soybean hulls, corn gluten feed and corn with the mineral built in. And then we wanted to look at feeding those for 1, 1.5, or 2 pounds a day with or without ionophores and implants. And as you see, as we add the amount of supplement that we're providing, it takes, even with this good quality hay, it takes 2.6 pounds of supplement per day to get that 1 pound a day on these cattle. When we add an ionophore, we get that extra, 1,400 pound a day. When we implant and don't use an ionophore, we're getting that 1/4 pound a day. And then whenever we do both, we provide the ionophore and the implant, we get both of those responses together essentially. If we push that up to feed 6.2 pounds of supplement per day, essentially the same results, only we can move those from gaining about 1.5 pounds a day up to nearly 2 pounds a day. And whenever we're targeting with hay plus supplement about 2 pounds a day, it's going to take about 9 pounds of supplement. So approximately 2/3 of the diet in that case will be the supplement. So quite a high feeding rate, but we can, with our technologies, we can move that from 2 pounds a day up to 2.4 pounds a day. Just looking at the cost of gain, as we add gain to these cattle, we feed for higher level of gain, even though we're increasing the total dollar spent, we're decreasing the feed cost per pound of gain. So, even feeding quite a bit more of a concentrate supplement, we're cheapening up the cost of gain. And then as we're adding value of gain to those animals, that's where the increase in net return comes. Here's an example of some research where they looked at feeding these cattle from 0.3 to 1.65% of body weight of distiller's grains, which was 1.5 up to 7.7 pounds of distiller's grains a day during a 56-day preconditioning period. And then they put them on wheat pasture for 128 days and then feedlot for 97 days. As we increase the amount of supplemental feed, we decrease the amount of hay, but we do increase the total amount of feed that's consumed by these calves. When we look at the gain on this during the preconditioning period, that's these orange bars here, it was 67 pounds or 1.2 pounds per day. When we increased that to 0.75% of body weight, we got right at 2 pounds per day. As we increase more feed, we increase gain up to about 2.8 pounds a day. We expect when these cattle are only gaining right at 1 pound a day versus nearly 3 pounds a day, we would expect a considerable compensatory gain. When they put these cattle out on wheat pasture, there was not a compensatory gain. Those cattle did gain more at 3 pounds per day on wheat pasture, but the cattle on the highest rate of gain still gained 2.8 pounds a day. It was only a 14% compensation by the time they slaughtered these cattle. So, most of 85% of the extra gain that was put on during this short period, that's 56 days, was retained by these cattle. So, in this case, we did not see, a lag or a decrease in performance based on the 56-day preconditioning period performance. I wanted to talk a little bit about feeding a total mixed ration. Not many people are doing this, and it's quite a bit more expensive as far as overhead, but you have a lot more control over what these cattle, these cattle are performing. So in this case, we fed these cattle for right at 40 days before we turned them out on wheat pasture. So essentially 1/3 grass hay, had corn, soybean hulls, and protein mix. And then we use, soybean hulls are really, really dry, so we use the water as a conditioner. We fed these cattle, limit fed them for about 1.5 pounds a day, and we implanted some and did not implant some, versus ad libitum or full feed management during that preconditioning period. Added 1 pound of gain a day on that diet, which was a fairly safe diet. But when we looked at during grazing, these cattle were also restricted in that grazing period performance. We had a higher stocking rate on these restricted cattle, but we didn't really slow these cattle down. We expect these cattle to gain about 2.2 pounds a day on wheat pasture, and that's what they did, even though they were gaining about 2.3 pounds a day during preconditioning. So their total preconditioning phase average daily gain, was 1.75 pounds to 2.6 pounds per day. And then when we took them all the way through finishing, we did not impact finishing performance. So just with these types of feeding programs, we still did not, have a dramatic change in finishing average daily gain compared to what you would expect. So to my last
I can remember what I need.
I need my prescriptions.
Prescriptions and supplements mainly.
So my last poll question, how long, well, that's the wrong one. let's stop that. Well, I'm having a hard time figuring out how to get this poll to show the last question. But in conclusion, we need to target performance based on the cattle type. If we have heifers or small frame steers, they're going to start fattening at a earlier age than large frame steers and at a lower average daily gain. So if we're looking at high growth, large frame, or implanted cattle, we can feed them for higher performance before we get into those flesh discounts, you know, for cattle being too fat. And that can be an issue if we overfeed cattle, even for these short periods of time. As a general rule, if we can target 1.75 to 2 pounds per day, that seems to be a really good sweet spot as far as being economical and as far as, you know, not spending a lot of money on feed and still, you know, managing those feed costs in cost of average daily gain. Supplement types and supplement rates should match the forage resources along with our targeted performance. And along with that, if we have a good quality supplement, we can get, you know, 2 pounds a day, you know, at that 0.75 to 1% of body weight. And then total mixed ration should be designed to hit targeted performance, you know, but we need to have adequate fiber levels because we don't want to burn these cattle out. And if we get into too, you know, energy dense diet for this period, you know, we can really impact their subsequent performance, even though we can put a lot of gain on them. We need to be careful about balancing our protein and mineral concentrations. And then also with these, you know, having a lot of those animal husbandry animal husbandry skills involved as far as feed management is really a key to success. We need to have bunk rating, on-time delivery, a good quality mix on our feed, and all that. So really on these programs, these cattle are really, you know, fairly forgiving. And, you know, we don't actually have to do everything right. I use this picture sometimes as an example of, you know, how we can do almost everything wrong as far as, you know, this may be a safety nightmare where the guy's under his propped up truck, you know, welding on his gas tank. But, you know, so we don't have to do everything right, but we do have to do some things right and have some reason for doing what we're doing. So with that, I encourage you to ask any questions. We have a few in the chat, and if we have, you know, anything else you need to reach out to me for, I'm available. My office, you know, number and email address are up on the screen right now. So with that, did we have any questions in the chat?
Oh, there's a couple questions in the chat for you.
So Doug asked if I can send this presentation to anybody that really wants it. That growth chart, I can find that and send it to you, Doug Galloway. Just shoot me an email and I'll try to remember to get that to you. Earl asked, we encourage the use of ionophores. Can it be hard for small producers to use? Any advice for the small producer? So in most cases, whenever I'm, you know, working up diets, whether it's in a supplement that we're having blended, or mixing on our own farm. Some of these, well, any of these minerals that are designed for self-feeding can be used in a blend with the byproduct feeds that we're using. You know, the real good quality R1600 minerals that have rumensin in them. You know, they provide you know, it's already, you know, safe. And if we can feed that to these cattle at, you know, that 0.2 to 0.25 pounds per day or a quarter pound per day, you know, we can get that effective dose in that. The B1440 minerals, most mineral, you know, companies, feed companies have one of those types of minerals, and most of your feed stores will have those on hand. So they're readily available, even if they don't, you know, keep them in stock. It's relatively easy to, you know, get, you know, just a few hundred pounds, because, you know, the feed companies are making those all the time. So it doesn't have to be a special made premix designed to go into your specific supplement. We can use some of these other mineral products that are more readily available, and those seem to work well for even large producers that are in these programs. So the cost and benefit of targeted feeding, instead of just, you know, we're going to try to, you know, feed only just a pound of cubes a day or something like that. So to me, the biggest benefit, you know, we're putting money up front into these cattle and increasing our cost per day. But if we balance our supplements to match what our hay supplies, and we can hit that targeted gain, then we can decrease the cost of production because we're decreasing the cost per pound of gain. And, you know, for most of us, when we think about trying to, you know, be economical and decreasing our total cost of production, we think of total dollars leaving. But if we can decrease the cost of production through pounds of cost per pound of gain, then we're, you know, we're selling pounds. So that's where that benefit comes from. And then when we're hitting, you know, we're getting value gain from these cattle as far as an improvement in prices or more money for a larger animal, you know, a lower cost of gain increases the net return from those programs.
Are there any other questions? Well, if not, Paul, I want to throw this slide up here real quick.
Stop my shirt.
So if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank everybody again for joining us this week. Next week, we will have Dr. David Lawman, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist, who will discuss budgets and break-even pricing. We hope everyone will join us for the next session. With that, I guess I will conclude this week's session. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you.